Yes, so let's start. I think it's one of the most pleasant days in academia, research, and application that can happen in the history of science and technology, because we have someone amidst us who represents a legacy, a lineage of a global heritage of what is latest in science and technology. The last 2 or 3 days, we are moving around with him. And I, being a naive person, with every minute and hour, I was learning from him, from his conversations, from his pointers, from his checks and balances of what is right and what is not so right. And it's absolutely a learning experience. I'm very thankful to all the departments, all the schools and centers so far who have met him and have shared and deliberated a very large gamut of exchanges at all levels. Students, faculties, research programs, courses together, and more than that, to form a global network of knowledge systems based on fundamental science, physical science, applied science, and its application in technology. So he's a person who has many huge feathers in his cap, and I think I'll just read out a few, which will show that how exhaustive he is in scientific administration and technological decision-making across universities in the world. So he holds a chairmanship at the Department of Physical Chemistry. He's a director of the Center for Computational Science, as an associate director in the Center of Advanced Research Computing, and also he's an honorary professor in computer science. In addition, and I think more than that, he's a professor in applied high-performance computing at the University of Amsterdam, and he's also a professor adjunct at the Yale University School of Medicine. He is active in a broad area of interdisciplinary research, including condensed matter. So we are coming to more deeper things: condensed matter physics and chemistry, the material sciences, as well as life and medical sciences, in all of which high-performance computing plays, especially today, is beginning to play a huge role. He has led many large-scale projects, including, I think there's a huge list, and I'll just read a few only, including the EPSRC Reality Grid and eScience Pilot project, which belongs to the preceding decade, its extension as a platform grant later in the last decade, and the EU FP7 Virtual Physiological Human Network of Excellence, which comes from the previous decade to the recent decade. He's also the principal investigator on several current grants from the European Commission and other agencies, including the EU Age 2020 project, Verified Exascale Computing for Multiscale Applications, VECMA 2018-2021, and the EU Age 2020 Center of Excellence in Computational Biomedicine, CompBiomed and CompBiomed2, which are very recent developments. He has been the recipient of many awards. Just to name a few, the US NSF and the DOE, as well as the European Supercomputing Awards from DESA and PRACE, PRACE, which provides access to several petascale computing. And in that position, he has also chaired the UK Collaborative Computational Projects, the steering panel from 2005 to 15. And then he served as a program committee member in many conferences, the best ones, including the 2002 Nobel Symposium on Self-Organization. That's absolutely incredible. He is the chair of the United Kingdom's eScience All Hands Meeting 2008, and of the Discrete Simulation of Fluid Dynamics Conference 2003. But I think more than that, he's an avid writer, a very deep writer. His books are popular, his books are also deep. So he has presented books to people like us on complexity and related things like irreversibility and allied themes of research. But some of his books, which has become very important today, are the one which I just came to know, which is on molecular dynamics. Perhaps some of you have read them. And the two best-selling books which are bestsellers across the world is The Arrow of Time and The Frontiers of Complexity, both with Professor Roger Highfield. And he's a lead author of the first textbook on computational biomedicine and similar books which are related to that. Most of his books come from the premier publishing group, which is the Oxford University Press. So he's also the founding member of the United Kingdom's government's E-Infrastructure Leadership Council and a medical academy nominated expert to the UK Prime Minister's Council Science and Technology on data, on algorithms, and on modeling, which all have led to the creation of the London-based Turing Institute. That's incredible. And he is also the member, an honorary member of the Academia Europaea, as well as the London Centre for the Theory and Simulation of Materials, the Thomas Young Centre. He is widely known across circles, and just a few days, 2 days back, we had another esteemed person like him, Professor Michael Berry. Probably some of you have met him and seen him. He was with the Department of Mathematical Physics, Computational Physics, and then we just came to know that Professor Berry and him, they're old friends. That shows the legacy. But I think there is one final point which I cherish in the heart, a personality as a naive person in chemistry and physics. I have always looked up to him as like one of the gurus, the godlike figure of what we call dissipative structures, complexity, and nonlinear dynamics. Almost the father, the pioneer of that. And that's Professor Ilya Prigogine. So Professor Peter Coveney worked with Professor Ilya Prigogine in the late 1980s. So let's give a big hand to Professor Coveney. We are so honored to have you, sir, amidst us. And he also worked with the celebrated mathematician, Professor Oliver Penrose, who is incidentally the brother of another celebrated Nobel laureate, Professor Robert Penrose. And I think we can go like that. So at this moment, I'll request our Dean of Student Affairs, Professor Shailendra Varshney, to accompany our Dean Outreach, Madam Shagota Dasgupta, to felicitate and grace our esteemed speaker for today. Indunil, let's give a standing ovation. Professor Peter Coveney, essentially from the University College of London, United Kingdom, which is one of the oldest and the largest science and technology organization in the world. So in India, we grace the Atithi like this, Atithi Deva Bhava. We don't see God, but God comes in various forms as special guests. He does not belong to the sky, he is right here within us. So with this, we'll have Professor Coveney speaking on a very important subject. Let us all settle, and perhaps for the next 1 hour, we listen to him, and then we can have a few minutes, maybe 15, 20 minutes of questions and answers, a round of it. Thank you so much, sir.
Well, Joy, thank you very much indeed. I'm almost overwhelmed by your introduction. I'm going to talk about the title I was asked to speak under. I didn't create this one. I am in the business of communicating science as well as doing it, and this talk is intended to be intelligible to most of the people here, not all of whom are in the areas of specialism that I'm talking about. So I'm aiming to be understood, comprehensible rather than comprehensive. Now, I run a Center for Computational Science at UCL that you mentioned, and it's interesting for everyone to understand. We have a catchphrase, and it's this: advancing science through computers. That's what we do. And that means we're domain agnostic. It's a deliberate act to say that I reserve the right to work in any area that I'm interested in. I refuse to be categorized or boxed in. And this has obviously become an important issue in recent times, because as I'm learning at IIT here in Kharagpur, interdisciplinarity is now recognized as a rather essential capability. But it is a bit demanding, because you then have to sort of work across domains. One of the secrets of being successful at that is an ability to collaborate effectively with people in areas who know more than yourself. And that's a bit tricky sometimes for academics who want to feel that they know everything involved. But it's the classic scenario with a non-linear dynamical system. You're aiming, in this case, for the whole being greater than the sum of the parts. And that's essentially how I've managed to do the things that I have. So we're talking here about advances in computational chemistry and quantum computing. This is clearly a personal view. And what will come up during this is a set of subjects. These are cast here as with the chemistry element to the fore, but the methodologies are universal. And you can, I hope, understand how you could apply some of the things we're talking about in different domains, which is all part of the high interesting aspect of computational science. The methods may be developed in one area, but they can be transferred effectively somewhere else, and quite quickly if you have the expertise and can build a team that does it. So the first part of the talk is actually on what people now currently in some circles call classical computing. I would call it conventional computing. Most, you'll see, of what I do involves the use of ultra high-end supercomputers. And there's two areas that I'm going to talk about here, but remember they need to be recognized as just applications of a methodology. So that bit is the first part. The second part is looking at what quantum computing can do in this sort of area. It has two bits. One is actually, well, you'll see in the first instance that those subjects involve a conflation or confabulation of conventional physics-based methods and AI technologies to accelerate what we're trying to do. And the same is sort of true in the other half, where we use quantum computing to do simulations of the sort we're trying to do in the conventional world, but also use it to potentially accelerate machine learning methods. So one of the things that I care about is the reliability of the methods, the algorithms which we use. And the reason for that should be clear. In recent times, there's been a lot of emphasis on having research which is reproducible, and that sometimes is seen as a hurdle for people. But to be honest, that's the fundamental criterion in science, that you should produce reproducible work, because science has a unique place in human endeavor. It's the one field which is supposedly objective, meaning we all agree on what we're doing. It's different from most other areas. But if you come along with a scientific method and no one else can do what you're doing, you're going to become dead in the water, particularly with computational methods, etc. That's becoming something you can control more easily than when people were doing things in a more hidden way. But beyond using the computer and explaining in a what I call a post hoc rationalization of what's happening in systems, it's clear, I think, to many here that what we're trying to do is use computers to make predictions that someone else will listen to, and they better be reliable if they're going to listen to them. But they happen faster than the event itself, and so they are actionable. That word may come up repeatedly. Actionable outcomes means I can run a calculation or a simulation faster than the event itself, and therefore, if it's reliable, armed with this quantification of uncertainty and so on, you're going to believe what I say, or you can test whether I am. This is common challenge today. First, you need pretty powerful computers to be able to run some of these calculations fast enough, and then you have to equip them with what's called here VVUQ, which is validation, verification, and uncertainty quantification. So I want to spend a bit of time on what we need to do there, because that's the difference between producing something others are interested in or not. And we'll probably get on to the most clear-cut example of producing actionable predictions, and that's weather forecasting. People always would like to know tomorrow's weather today, not in 3 months' time. Meteorological offices need to have access to very powerful computers for that reason, and they have to use them in a special way, and they come with some uncertainty quantification so we can know what the result is. We don't want to wait 3 months on a serial machine to get a prediction of tomorrow's weather immediately. Almost no one's interested, only the people who are testing the algorithm. Is that visible? Okay, yes, so that's great. We'd already prepared this one earlier, but we were trying to allow me sort of more freedom to move around, and then the wrong file was copied across. So this is the general picture that we're addressing scientifically with the role of computers. First, you've got some sort of reality that you're trying to capture, and you have a model of it. I will treat AI and its methods slightly separately, because there's a question there of whether we even have a mathematical model. But in a physics-based approach, the whole point is you've got some mathematical representation of the problem, might be written down in, quite often, differential equations, partial differentiation, differential equations, and most of those things are intractable unless you put them on a computer. But ultimately, it's this cycle here where you have reality, you think you know how to describe it. This is interesting because it's mechanistic, and you put it on a computer. But immediately when you have this supposedly virtuous circle, you run into challenges, such as, was the mathematical representation acceptable in its own right? But then there's this slightly more subtle thing. You wrote down the equations for the system, and then you code it up. And that introduces an issue that's often referred to as verification. Is the software you're running with actually a true representation of the mathematics you started with? And you can sometimes be shocked to find that it isn't. And I can stand here and tell you now, for example, there's an issue we have uncovered or recognized very clearly now, and that is, on a computer, of course, all computers today worth their salt are digital computers. The world is not really digital, so a computer representation of reality is like a Lego model, if I may use that case. It has jagged edges because it's got lots of discontinuities in it. And the question is, are the floating point numbers actually reliable enough to capture the dynamics? And in many cases, where there are chaotic behaviors, they're not, but virtually nobody realizes it. But then you've got the computer model and the reality. Suppose you've verified it, you need to compare the two. And that's the kind of acid test. We say scientifically, there's something out there that we're trying to show we can represent. And if we do this in an interesting way, using uncertainty quantification, we build up a capability to run the calculations fast enough and perform things that I'm calling UQ here in a fashion that goes with those calculations and tells everyone essentially what the level of uncertainty in the actual calculations is. So uncertainty quantification is an area that is itself a very respected discipline. It's typically dominated by applied mathematicians and statisticians and engineers in this, because engineering is a case in point where people build models to build things, and they want those things to be safe, etc., and they absolutely have to show that they're reliable. And in the medical area, which is of interest, the same thing is happening as we develop in silico models. We call them virtual humans. The virtual human is a digital twin of myself, the Lego version of me. How reliable is it? So there exists a whole range of techniques that are off the shelf for doing this. This is not a lecture to discuss the details of that, but you can look up the methods. Things like what are called polynomial chaos stochastic collocation, quasi-Monte Carlo methods, and actually quite a lot more methodologies we've been involved in ourselves in developing more recently, because like any other respectable subject, there's a research end to this that you'll get out of my talk. But the characteristic case for physics-based models is, for uncertainty quantification, we're looking at two things in UQ. It's the uncertainty that's derived from the parameters that are in the model, and that's called epistemic uncertainty usually. And the other source is aleatoric, which is to do with the number of random seeds that are in the model. They're different in nature, because in principle, with enough data or better theories, you improve the parameters, but you can do nothing about the random seeds. They live with you, so they're different qualitatively. But in general, you might have a few parameters with a physical meaning, and that's important. The physical meaning is also helpful to you in targeting how to adjust the model, compared with what I will say about AI shortly. So you get you're able to identify the parameters, the dominant ones that control the uncertainty, and focus your attention only on those. And this is very much part of trying to get actionable outcome. So the case of weather forecasting, just putting up slides that make sure people understand what we're getting at here. The source of aleatoric uncertainty is rife in problems that are computationally challenging, and particularly of fluid dynamics. We have this turbulence problem, and turbulence is a manifestation of chaos. It just means a single simulation. Well, the system exhibits extreme sensitivity to the initial conditions, and that is a recipe for uncertainty and a lack of reproducibility. If you run one simulation and think that that's going to keep you going for actionable outcomes, you realize that the next person, even yourself who runs the simulation, will get a different answer. And the question is, how do you control that uncertainty? So you've got a measure of something that's an objective, it'd be a statistical measure. You're not relying on the outcome of a single simulation. In the UK, we have all kinds of weather patterns that matter to people. So what happens, and the way this is developed goes back to Tim Palmer, who it turned out that Michael Berry taught as a student in Bristol many years ago. He's the doyen of the introduction of ensemble methods in weather forecasting, and by an ensemble I mean I have to run many simulations, and if I've got a large machine and I control it, that's okay. If you've got limited resources and you listen to what I'm saying, you're going to say, how the hell do I do that? Because an ensemble that has to be run sequentially is going to take you a long time. But if you have a powerful machine, they run 50 to 100 of these things concurrently across the machine. Each one is a major HPC application, but you're then varying the initial conditions and some of the parameters that you don't know for sure, and you unleash some prediction. It might take a few hours to get up a prediction with the uncertainty involved, and then you're predicting tomorrow's weather today. That's the kind of secret of it. So if you're in not quantum chemistry, but chemistry in general, and you're going to do molecular dynamics, you know what's coming, because molecular dynamics is chaotic as well, though most of the practitioners either don't realize it or they ignore it, and then they have no control over the uncertainty of their predictions. Here's an example in the biomedical area that is, I'm just trying to show you kind of an iconic graphic that represents this. In the UK, very early on when COVID got going, the government set up an advisory body to tell it what was going to happen. There became a great deal of interest in predictions in the biomedical field. And medicine and life sciences historically don't do computing, they don't do modeling, they don't believe predictions. But they have to pay attention to this. There was nothing else. And you certainly couldn't do AI because there was no data for such a thing, no precedent. So this is an illustration of work by one group at Imperial College. They produced a report for the government, which was a single simulation of a code that was at the time called IMP, as in Imperial College. It was a spaghetti code that only Neil Ferguson, who'd done string theory as a DPhil in Oxford and was then became an epidemiologist, was setting up. He had a flu code, and then he added it to the pandemic. So people were using this to make predictions, and all I really want to convey here is the massive uncertainty in the model that we explored, because people started getting nervous about why we should believe this guy's code. It was inaccessible, not reproducible, and so on. It's really just showing you something incredibly important, which is the cumulative deaths that are supposed to happen as the result of the onset of the spread of the virus. This is really important. It's literally a matter of life or death. And you can understand, I think, if I can make predictions in a hurry and advise someone, they will take decisions. In this case, all Neil Ferguson's team did was run one simulation, which was the orange dot there, but it was enough to worry the then Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who was taking a gung-ho approach to COVID, to actually take the country into lockdown, because he saw the number of predicted deaths that were getting into thousands from this model. I have no time to go into the details of this now. It's a sort of agent-based style model, and it has the geography of the UK, it has the mechanism of propagation of the disease, such as it was understood, and the non-interventional, non-pharmaceutical interventions, so not taking drugs, but whether you should close pubs, make people stay at home, social distancing, they're all in there. Now, if you do uncertainty quantification, and that's what we did there, you have to be working with the person whose code is in play. We don't know that code particularly, so we worked with Neil Ferguson, and my first question to him was, how many parameters have you got in your model? You remember what I said? To do UQ, I need to know those parameters. He had no idea, and so we looked at the model. It had 940 parameters. So I told him how many parameters are in it, and I said, now, which ones matter? And we sort of whittled it down to of the order of 60 of those, 20 in each of those subdomains I described earlier, he knew would matter. And if you remember, perhaps I just touched on this with the standard UQ methods that we were using here, such as actually something called stochastic collocation. These algorithms suffer from the curse of dimensionality, which means the computational cost of performing the calculations scales exponentially in the number of parameters you're investigating. So once you get parameter sets that are getting up to 20 or more, and each individual run is costing a significant amount, it becomes intractable. And I'm going to say more about that in a minute. But in this case, we broke it down into the 3 areas, and we were able to look at the problem in a global sense eventually by combining the ones that mattered. And so the main point here is, though, the distribution of the cumulative deaths is a characteristic thing we're concerned about. Because if we know the probability distribution, then we can predict the statistical properties. Has this thing died on me? Let me see if... So, the thing that's interesting about these distributions is, well, that one's very obviously a fat tail distribution, long tail. It's nothing like a Gaussian distribution. And you'll never know that unless you run enough simulations in the way we do. Ensembles for uncertainty quantification is the name of the game. But when you see a distribution like that, you know that if it's not Gaussian, the expectation value or the mean of a property that you really care about, that's the cumulative deaths, isn't centrally dependent on the peak in the distribution. That distribution, the mean value will be shifted because of all these weighted things at long time. And that's known very closely. So as a matter of fact, Tim Palmer, the guy I mentioned earlier, and I've come to know and do some interesting work with him, he immediately saw that this is exactly the sort of thing you get in climate modeling. So climate prediction is a very important thing for most of us, not Donald Trump. The last thing he wants is quantification of the reliability of a model. But if you're at the International Panel on Climate Change, a model that's put forward there absolutely has to be equipped with uncertainty quantification to have any credibility and to become an actionable policy. And it happens that if you want to know the temperature of the surface of the Earth at the end of this century, you need to do these types of uncertainty quantification, and they turn out to have fat tails. The fat tail distribution means the probability of what you thought were rare events is actually much higher. So it's like 10 or more % chance that it might be 6 degrees higher than it is now, and that's really bad news. But if it was, the prediction was just using a normal distribution, it would be totally negligible. And I put it to you that if you had a 10% chance of your own bank account being broken into, you'd care about it. And that's the sort of thing we're talking about here. So we've been involved in projects, and one of them was mentioned by you in the introduction, which is about developing an uncertainty quantification capability that's agnostic in the sense that I said earlier, applies to all kinds of problems. So that's what we produced. First, a toolkit called VECMA, and it's been developed in subsequent UK-only work with international collaborators. I have no chance of going into all the details here, but the key tool involved, and it's all open source and you can get hold of it and use it, is EasyVVUQ, and it's not hype in this case. We're not charging you anything. You can check yourself. It's rather easy to instrument your code in order to probe the uncertainties, and those uncertainties, parameters, and random seeds. And that is what you do with using EasyVVUQ. You actually then have to have a job submission tool that will run this thing. Because the name of the game, maybe you're losing it, I hope not, is I've got a lot of nodes on the machine because I use large computers, and I can run all of these things concurrently. I don't do the things sequentially. In the time I do one of these calculations, and that's where I get the wall clock time advantage. And this is what we do with molecular dynamics. So this is just a structure of it. This is a story which some people will know here. There's not really a UK machine in sight there because at the scale I operate, they're not big enough, actually. I'm lucky enough to have allocations of time on the Department of Energy's largest machines, and they dominate the top 10 of the top 500. We've been using Frontier at Oak Ridge National Lab and Aurora at Argonne National Lab. Those are the first two exascale machines to come into existence. So these machines have of the order of 80 or more thousand nodes on them, and each node either has 8 or 12 in the different machine GPUs on it. So we have access to machines which have 80 or more thousand GPUs on them. We can get a whole lot going. Neither of these are NVIDIA machines. One of them is AMD and the other is Intel. But this is the scale at which we need to do things. And I'll show you an example of that with molecular dynamics in a moment. And this is why I want people to understand molecular dynamics also has a problem with certainty quantification. It goes back to the chaotic nature of the dynamics. This is just qualitatively trying to show you, if you start a molecular dynamics simulation off and one that you start later, which is arbitrarily close in phase space, typically they're going to diverge exponentially, and therefore one simulation isn't very reliable. But on the other hand, if you run a lot of them, and you run them concurrently, this is actually what I would call an enhanced sampling method, because the trajectories explore different areas of phase space, and you see some are getting trapped in one area, others in a different one. And again, you run one simulation, but here many times you get the uncertainty out of it. And we can do this in a few hours. So we're predicting things with molecular dynamics with an uncertainty. So this is the picture that I'm trying to over to you here, because the embarrassing thing that is revealed in the book that I published last year is that the molecular dynamics community sort of is still operating in an antediluvial regime. When Alder and Wainwright got their first simulations going, they were studying hard sphere collision in the late 1950s and early 60s. But at the same time, there was a school of ergodic theorists, particularly Russians, which included the likes of Arnold, Kolmogorov, and Sinai and others, who were showing that, guess what, as few as 2 hard spheres on a billiard table have a chaotic property. And what's interesting about the chaotic property is it's the connection with thermodynamics, which we're all trying to do to calculate things like free energies of binding. That's a macroscopic quantity. And this is something I can't develop here. It's described in our book, that just running a long simulation doesn't gain you anything there. You'd have to run it for longer than the lifetime of the universe before it went through all the individual members of the ensemble, the different microstates, but that's not realistic. What's actually happening is you start with a bundle of initial conditions. Under the mixing of the dynamics, that spreads out. Just as if I open a bottle of aftershave in the corner of this room, we waited a certain amount of time, we'd end up with a uniform distribution. That's what I'm getting at. It's the equilibrium state of the system. But it only means something at the level of the distribution, not at the level of a trajectory. It cannot be defined equilibrium in a trajectory sense. So this is discussed in the book that I published last year, because I've spent a lot of time investigating this. You don't challenge the sort of establishment in an area that's 50, 60 years old, like molecular dynamics, unless you can show they got it wrong. And this is fundamentally what we've been doing with access to these big machines, running ensembles, looking at the distributions. None of them typically are Gaussian. They all have fat tails and other things. And so the statistical properties and uncertainty quantification is very different from what they'd expect. So here's just an illustration for the molecular dynamics case. If you're looking at predicting ligand-protein binding affinities, which is central to drug discovery, how reliable are the calculations? I've said enough for you to realize that if you run one single simulation, I'm not going to believe it. I know how many I need to run for a given methodology to get sort of reliable predictions out of it. So there's the source of the parametric and aleatoric uncertainty and how I have to do the calculations, with a distribution that looks like this typically of the way in which the algorithm predicts the free energy of binding. Again, it's non-Gaussian there, and depending on what things you average over, such as all the replicas with their initial conditions or over the parameters, you get different levels of uncertainty. The take-home message here is actually that the greatest source of uncertainty in a molecular dynamics simulation in this context is the uncertainty in the initial conditions, the presence of the random seed, because it's a chaotic system. And so I want to go quickly onto another area that's really besetting people. We had discussions of that yesterday around molecular dynamics and AI, because there's a whole school of people now trying to remove the need to use these force fields, which can have up to thousands of parameters, replace it by some trained AI system, which they then pronounce as being fantastic, you've never seen anything better. And then I ask them how many parameters have they got in their model, and they don't know, but we look at it and the answer is about 1 million. So we went from a problem which had 1,000 parameters to 1 million, and I'm being told that that's a better position to be in, where the parameters in the AI problem are connection weights in a neural network. And those connection weights tell you nothing about the physico-chemical nature of the problem. They're just correlation coefficients that were being twiddled to get a fit when the training was going on. So I'm pointing at a very severe weakness of AI methodologies. When they're applied scientifically, we don't have a U-cube methodology that works for them. Here is just showing you what goes on in a classical molecular dynamics force field. 1 or 2 people I know are nodding in the audience, because this is a typical type of force field which shows bonded interactions, because you're using a ball and spring type of model, and then long-range non-bonded interactions, which are electrostatic or van der Waals. So when you get to this scale, I'm wrestling with actually thousands of parameters in a protein model with a ligand. Thousands. Don't worry, because I just told you that these other guys would have to wrestle with 1 million, and that's the low end of what you get in AI. So the question is, how do we deal with 1,000? Remember, I said UQ and the standard methods suffer from something called the curse of dimensionality. How the hell are we going to deal with this? We've had to develop scalable uncertainty quantification methodologies to handle this type of thing. And just briefly, in the sort of physico-chemical materials end, I'm showing you 4 different calculation methods. 2 on the right-hand side are methods we've developed for doing binding free energy calculations. One of them is a sort of absolute value, and the other is a relative binding free energy, where you're comparing the difference between 2 molecules sitting in an active site. On the left, there are these materials properties like the Young's modulus and the Poisson ratio that people care about when they run molecular dynamics simulations. And these things are just showing again what the level of uncertainty is when you run one simulation, when this uncertainty is shown here to be so wide. How can you dare to tell someone what to do if you run one simulation for such a model? And again, you get marginal distributions over there. No time to go through it in detail, other than to say, look at the bottom panel of the 3 in the 2 cases there is extremely sharp. And what that's telling you is if you average over the uncertainties in the parameters in this model, that creates they're the source of the highest uncertainty in the model, higher than the uncertainty generated by the random seeds. So it means the models are very sensitive to the force fields. Now, people who work in classical molecular dynamics never talk about parameters being changed. It's like they were written on tablets of stone, handed down from Mount Sinai over decades, and you only use those particular parameters. So essentially no one's worrying about the uncertainty, so we don't think about it. But if you start asking, what's the uncertainty in those parameters, the whole thing starts to evolve in a challenging way. And that's what we've been doing here. I won't go through the details. In a paper we published a couple of years ago here, it was showing how you can get control of the uncertainty and find the most dominant terms in this massive force field matrix by doing the methodology I'm mentioning here. And we use two methods. One is called deep active subspace, which actually has an interesting machine learning component to it. Another is a kernel-based method related to Gaussian processes, but it's more general, which is called gradient kernel dimension reduction. It's easier to try and explain what we're doing here. We take all the parameters that we have to work with, thousands of them, we have to figure out which ones make a difference. And the algorithms are intended to pick that up by combining the parameters and then investigating which group of them has the dominant uncertainty in the problem and which ones don't contribute. And in the highly technical language of uncertainty quantification, the ones that don't contribute are called sloppy variables. It means if I change them, or parameters, they don't actually affect the uncertainty. But there's a set of them which do, and this is related to sort of matrix diagonalization and the size of the eigenvalues and their separation in the methodologies. You then get a reduced subspace which has all, or essentially all, the uncertainty in it. And that subspace in MD, when we do it, we find is one-dimensional, which is great, but it might be too good to be true if you thought I meant there's only one parameter here. This is more sophisticated because what you're actually doing is a kind of nonlinear version of principal component analysis. So that space is rotated in the number of the variables that are actually dominating the uncertainty. And these are just pictures of what you do to find that direction. And this is results. Again, I have to rush through this. What's interesting is I told you there were 4 cases I showed on an earlier slide, and these are 4 instances now. Materials problems on the left, and the free energy calculations on the right. And if you were an aficionado in AMBER, you'd love to be interpreting what those combinations of parameters mean there. They mean something physico-chemical. And you can see that typically the ones that dominate the uncertainty are of the order of the fingers on one hand, out of 100, 1,000 or more. Well, this is very powerful because it tells you what you need to do to get more accurate results. And so the red and the blue happen to be the 2 very different methods that we used, gradient kernel dimension reduction and a discrete active subspace. They end up giving very similar results. How we fare with this one. So this picture is just showing you for the active sites, if you're into predicting binding of ligands to proteins. We get the uncertainty. We also know which parameters are the ones generating the most of it. And that can be very handy if you need to develop a drug in a certain way. You can manipulate it. And so what I'm now going to quickly talk about is what I was threatening to do earlier, and that is, okay, that's what we do with physics-based methods. It's computationally demanding, but we come up with pretty reliable error bars. That's what we're talking about, the distribution of the predicted free energies and so on. So what's going on in the case of AI, and this is something I mentioned in one of our meetings yesterday. I was asked by the Financial Times to participate in an article they ended up writing, which was about AI 10 years later. The sort of headline was, "Where are the drugs?" And you may be aware there aren't any. There have not been any drugs that have passed regulatory approvals and are on the market that could be said to be AI-based. It's a source of embarrassment, but the message wasn't doom and gloom, although the industry has suffered from cratering levels of investment, and companies such as one I mentioned yesterday that were once a unicorn worth billions of dollars and no longer exist. I have at least 2 people who work with me who lost their jobs working for that company. So the issue is, in the article, don't worry, you've got a new version of AI, and don't we know it, every day we almost have a new one. At the moment, what was missing there in the good old-fashioned AI was it didn't do generative AI. And you know, generative AI is almost last year's form of AI because we deal with agentic AI now, and you don't know what will come next. But generative has some promise in that it can be more creative in discovering molecules. But anyway, the point I'm trying to convey here is you have a method such as AlphaFold 2 that won a Nobel Prize from a paper that was published in Nature in 2021, and that was announcing to have solved actually what the progenitors called the protein folding problem. This isn't the protein folding problem at all, it's protein structure prediction. You know the primary sequence and you predict the 3-dimensional structure. The methodology certainly tells you nothing about how the proteins get to the folded state. But nonetheless, it's said to solve the problem of designing drugs. And since I'm trying to get to drug discovery in a moment, it behoves me to look at this. But I want to look at it from a UQ style. And my first question to them is, and I did this through my co-author, who's a distinguished journalist, who went to John Jumper, who's the first author on the paper, and I said to him, ask him to tell us how many parameters are in his model. And when the answer came back, the answer was, does anyone know how many parameters there are before I give this away, or is it written up there? 10 to the 8 parameters, right? This is nothing compared with large language models which yield trillions, so it's not quite a billion. But my point in AI is this, that if you have that number of parameters in play, you can fit anything, especially if it's a held-out data set where you control all of it. That isn't the issue. I'm not impressed by that. What I am impressed by is how good is it at predicting things it got nowhere near seeing before. And that's not mentioned properly there. And it's the kind of question you have to ask scientifically of a methodology. You don't just swallow it, although for some reason in AI, see they do this. People are told by the companies who we bow down to that their methods are fantastic, so people uncritically use them. In this case, you know, it was 3 years later, at the time the Nobel Prize was being awarded to my erstwhile UCL colleague Demis Hassabis and others, that a paper appeared in Nature Methods with an interesting title which says, you can read it there, AlphaFold predictions are valuable hypotheses and accelerate but do not replace structure determination. From my point of view, when I read that, it means this method is not actionable. The whole point about computing methods is they're supposed to be reliable, so I don't need to do the structure determination, which is very long and tricky. And the reason is, it's just not very reliable at predicting genuinely new structures that are different from the ones that are in the database, and it's a degradation of that performance that's very hard to get hold of. It's the business of uncertainty quantification to get answers like that, and that's why I wanted to say what can be done about uncertainty quantification in AI methods. And in practice, or let's say in principle, we should use the same methods I described earlier. We look at the parameters and the random seeds in it, and we analyze their effect. The parameters here, as we've just agreed, are astronomical in size. And unlike a physics-based model, we have no idea which of the connection weights have anything interesting to do with the biology, in this case, of what's going on. We have no idea because they were just tuning parameters. So we don't quite know how to do this. And I'm just mentioning here, even if you somehow can do that, that you identified some lower dimensional set that might be called a reduced manifold or intrinsic dimension of this network, where all the interesting things happen, you just don't know what that means to adjust or improve it, unlike the physics. This is a serious weakness of the methods. So I'm actually working with a colleague, Wouter Edeling, at CWI, which is the Mathematics and Computer Science Institute in Amsterdam, on this. If you've never heard of it, think again, they were the people who created Python. So they have a good record in computer science. So we're looking at how we can use these discrete active subspace methods to reduce the dimensionality. And we've been able to show that in some of these cases you can get very low dimensional reductions in the uncertainty, which is great. The limitation still remains. How do you know what those things correspond to improve or reduce the uncertainty? And we just don't have answers. So time is running on here. And because I'm so excited and the microphone's been dying, etc., I haven't got through all of this very quickly. But let's just remember, in these areas, one of the applications is drug discovery. Drug discovery is in a shocking state globally. It takes, on average, 10 years, let's say $3 billion, to get a drug to market, and it succeeds only around 4% of the time you start. And so we need to be able to do better than that. And the question is, how? What goes on in these companies is they believe in the blockbuster, meaning one drug for everyone, because that's the most effective way of them making money. It's so hard to do it we make one and you believe it works. And statistically, we know even for the most successful drugs, they rarely work for more than 50% of the population. You have to hope the other 50% don't get damaged by it, and that's related to the clinical trials end of the game, where most of the problems actually arise when you're testing. So what I wanted to do, and I mentioned this earlier about this so-called impeccable workflow, which is to do with drug discovery, where we've put the entire preclinical workflow for drug discovery onto a large computer, and you know I mean large one, Frontier and Aurora. And what we're doing here is setting up a combination of some powerful AI methods that are generative with physics-based techniques in combination with experimentalists, as I was mentioning earlier, who involve themselves in trying to work with us to design the drugs effectively. I'll show another picture which is more graphically compelling than this. This just simply shows that you can start with things like docking. Docking is very fast, cheap and cheerful. You can make it even more cheap and cheerful if you do AI learning of docking scores. That's quite efficient. So that in a large machine, you can actually be looking at billions and billions of these compounds almost per day. But eventually, you have to break out of that. You have to do physics-based calculations. Fundamentally, they're using molecular dynamics in the way I described earlier, equipped with uncertainty quantification because we know how to do it, and then training the generative AI software that AstraZeneca developed called a reinvent, so that it doesn't just spew out new molecules that look wacky to a computer scientist, but can't be made. We have a combination of synthesizability and binding potency involved. And that then gets you in a virtuous circle where you can do absolute binding affinity calculations, and then you can do what they call lead development, where you've got some sort of hit, and you develop it into a stronger binder. But this scaling of the machine is incredibly powerful because you can do all of these and many targets concurrently. So this is on a really big industrial scale. This is just a picture of what happens when you combine reinvent with one of our free energy calculation methods. And it does show, and in the time available, you can't really talk in detail on this. The paper was published a year or two back. It does show that as the new molecules are generated, a significant tail of new ones with higher binding potency does get evolved. And they're quite significantly different from the ones you began with. So this is a graphic, which I hope might become as iconic as the one on Neil Ferguson's COVID sim code, just showing you what's going on here. So you remember the sideways on funnel, we had drugs being fed in at the top, and you ended up with one blockbuster. This is not like that. It's more of a perhaps blunderbuss style in that you've got the developments at both ends. And more to the point, you're actually injecting new molecules as you go down this loop. First for the absolute binding free energy calculations, and subsequently for the relative binding free energy, because the generative method is creating new molecules. You're not just killing stuff off. So you can end up with something that has multitudinous diversity, which in the end is what we need. We can't have this idea of a blockbuster drug that doesn't work for many. In most diseases, cancer in a particular case, the drugs barely work for typically 10% of the population because it's really a kind of rare disease that's different for every one of us. So we need to be able to do this. Anyway, that's work that we've done and emphasizes the importance of all our efforts on uncertainty quantification and concern about how they fit into a virtuous circle where we can reliably predict compounds. I didn't mention the experimentalists here, but they're deadly important. They tell us what they think matters and how we should adjust the algorithm, because we don't really believe that the AI itself, or even some of the physics-based models, are going to be predictive without them becoming involved. That's good because they buy into the collaboration, and we're taking note of them, and then they take note of us and go off and make things. And that's a commitment which is serious. So we've had, with the first case here, quite significant success in identifying what are called nanomolar potent molecules that are then at the level of activity that would be relevant to a binding development in a drug company or elsewhere. So here is a bit where I changed gear, because I said there were two parts. This is the quantum computing part. What can quantum computing do? Nothing I said before had anything to do with quantum computing. And you might be thinking, God, I'm going to talk about uncertainty quantification in quantum computing. That hasn't really taken off yet because we don't have problems that are serious enough to visit on it, but it is an open area. What I'm trying to tell you is what our efforts are in trying to, in the spirit of investigating new technologies for this Centre for Computational Science, we feel obligated to look at what quantum computers do. And one of the important points about quantum computing is that it should enable you to exploit the natural habitat of a wave function in Hilbert space, which means if you put it on a quantum computer, you can represent it much more compactly than on a conventional computer, where the size, as it were, of the wave function scales exponentially in some measure of the size, which might be this number of electron spin orbitals and things. So this is just indicating if you start looking at big problems without without a quantum computer, they become intractable pretty quickly because they're so large. And that's the limitation of conventional quantum chemistry. It can only look at very small systems. And some of this stuff is just in the gas phase. And while it can be interesting for probing and testing, it's very limited application. So what we do is, as ever, I insist that we use quantum hardware. We're not into vaporware, talking about things, but actually trying to do work with these devices. So over a period of time, it's just listing the types of machines we have access to, have had access to, and work on. Currently, we have a project with Google on Heisenberg magnetic model for frustrated antiferromagnetic systems on Kagame lab, which is quite a challenge to compute conventionally. So we're trying to see if their setup can help us with those calculations. In those instances, we don't touch their machine. They kind of won't let us. We write quantum circuits, them to write them, and then they run it and tell us what the results are. But IQM is very interesting to us. It's the leading European device manufacturer of superconducting computers. It currently has a 54-qubit device, and by the end of this year, we'll have a 150-qubit device. We work with them on the inside track, so they let us get onto these devices before they're ready to go out to the rest of the world, and we don't, fortunately, pay a penny, whereas you probably know only too well. If you want to get into production scale with companies like IBM and Google, you will be parting with hundreds of thousands of dollars before you know it. So that's an interesting area, and particularly interesting for us is that because of all the work we do using conventional supercomputers, we care deeply about the hybrid or classical coupling between a quantum device and a supercomputer or HPC. And it's the coupling of those that allows us to do things that I'm going to tell you about, which are particularly interesting. If you just stick with a quantum computer on its own, like effectively IBM has done and Google on the cloud, you just launch some job somewhere and then you have to wrestle with the output. But I've got coupled applications and workflows that need to iterate between them. And this is briefly the type of thing we do. We have two classes of application. One, hopefully you can see why we care about these. They're related to things I talked about already in the biomolecular area. It's a methodology that some people here know and love, QMM, and so we've got a multi-scale situation where the outer part of the simulation is done classically. The internal one is quantum mechanical. Quite a bit of that is density functional theory, but where you get down to the business end, maybe for a reaction rate, you're going to offload that bit and do a wave function calculation. You have to do that across the reaction coordinate. And so it's a continual iteration that we're talking about. The other case is going back to a challenging thing for prediction with machine learning. I didn't talk about it, but weather forecasting today, there's a kind of standoff between the tech companies who claim we can do it all by AI, from predicting weather forecast data without using physics-based models. Typically, it's also a combination. We're looking at not what AI can do for quantum in this case, but ironically what quantum can do for AI. And there's an interesting story there. So this is the situation for the case of QMM. I have to run through this quite quickly, and some of these slides are repeating things we've already looked at. And the idea is we're as scientists, we're trying to do scientific problems at the leading edge of what's going on, say, in drug discovery, biomolecular simulation. So we're tackling large problems in which part of the calculation is being done on a quantum device. The question for us if we're quantum aficionados, is does the quantum help in any way? And that's the open question here. But it's multi-scale stuff involving the combination of the HPC and the quantum device. So if you insert that into the problem, as this slide shows, you obviously then have additional overheads because you're shipping data between the two systems and flipping representations. But if the thing can do a better calculation there, then it can be worth doing. So this is the picture for a particular class of GPCRs, which are the third most widely targeted proteins in the pharma industry. So there are lots of different applications for cell signaling and other things here. If you can introduce an inhibitor that will stop the receptor or enzyme, whatever it is, actually actively carrying out its function. In this particular GPCR, it's an interesting autoproteolysis, which means it snips its own large polypeptide chain in two and rearranges. And that's a fundamental process in molecular biology, the making and breaking of peptide links. So looking down on that's just saying we telescope down or the microscope into the bit which is going to be run on the quantum device. And this is the sort of workflow we have. And this is done, some people here have heard me say this, heavily with our colleagues in Germany. They're among the most advanced infrastructurally to support this for reasons related to Euro HPC wanting to see quantum devices regarded as QPUs, like GPUs, on supercomputers, which suits me very nicely. So they've got these devices coupled onto the machine, and then they just allow us to use them to do our work. It's very valuable as a collaboration because they have a lot of technical expertise that helps us deploy and run. And this is just showing you a kind of workflow that's happening here. Notice a favored acronym that's been thrown around while I'm here, VQE, the Variational Quantum Open Solver. Briefly, for some of us who've worked on it, that's passé. It doesn't scale very interestingly. Our last work using that was at least 2 years or more ago for a nitrogen molecule, which gave us good results. But when you get to larger systems, there's too much noise coming from these NIST devices to be reliable. So we have another method that IBM is quite well known for. I think they call it something like SKD, and we call it quantum selective configuration interaction. So we're using the quantum device for the best thing. Remember, that's the representation of the wave function, nice and compact. It's like a dog in its kennel. It fits well. You evolve it in time. It generates a lot of configurations. And that's all you use the quantum device for, sampling. And then you bring the calculation back onto the adjacent supercomputer. And part of this work is, by the way, done in collaboration with NVIDIA. So they've come in and support this. They use Q2Q to help with the workflow. And then we use GPUs, which are an NVIDIA category. And the interesting thing then is when you expand the wave function that's been sampled on the quantum device on the classical one, you'll find yourself trying to diagonalize, say, a Hamiltonian matrix, which is of order 1 billion by a billion or more, which is pretty large. And you need then to have a scalable algorithm to deal with that. And that's part of what they've done with us, develop an algorithm which works in a highly scalable way up to that size. And I'm just telling you, in the end, LRZ doesn't currently have a large enough GPU farm to do this quickly, but if we use the NVIDIA machines, 1,200 GPUs, small compared with the machines I was mentioning earlier, the exascale machines have tens of thousands, but with 1,200 you can get that diagonalization effectively done within less than an hour. So it's the speed of it. So just briefly, this is the complexity of the system we're working with. A graphical representation. It's a membrane-bound protein in water. So the all-atom representation has over 1 million atoms in it. Much of it is water, as people will know. And then it's trying to drill down and show you what we're doing with which codes and where the calculations really matter to get, ultimately, a rate of the reaction, which you can then probe the influence of, let's say, mutations and other things, to understand what the catalysis mechanism is. So that stuff, and I mentioned really what we're doing here in terms of comparing QSCI with VQE. I don't need to dwell on it, but this type of development, this slide is probably a bit out of date now, is showing how the number of QPUs you can use effectively to solve a problem has actually started to increase very significantly in the last period, because this algorithm enables us to constructively use many QPUs, more than previously. So we're not alone in that, but actually some of our work is right up at the front end of that, and I'm looking forward to IQM's 150-qubit device, as I mentioned, may come in soon, because we're now in the era where we're sort of able to scale these things, even though there's a lot of horrible noise to contend with. So I don't want to go into some of the details here, but this is just an example of a paper we published initially on the QSCI method that compares well with a heat bath technology that's used in conventional quantum chemistry. And we were using the 54-qubit IBM device there, but we used 42 of the qubits because they gave us access to it well before they'd finalized it, and we were doing work on it, which essentially helped them to configure the quantum system. It's a bit of co-design. We've got a problem, you've got to help us solve it. So we had a paper published on that before the machine became available. I don't want to go into a lot of the detail here, plenty of it. And the issue for the aficionados is how much does the strong correlation, the wave function part, contribute to the accuracy versus, let's say, the size of the basis set. And fundamentally, this is one of the things we're trying to do. We know strong correlation in these systems is going to occur when there are bonds that are stretched. And that is going to happen when there are chemical reactions. So we expect to see potentially a benefit of using a quantum computer to do calculations where the bonds are stretched. That's exactly what a chemical reaction is about. I can't stand here now and tell you that we've got an answer for that, but we're actually still working on it. So that's the story there, and it's a collaboration I mentioned earlier with quite a lot of bodies involved, but that's the level at which we've needed to work in order to bring all of this stuff together. It's a pipeline that's been exposed at the International Supercomputing Conference in Tutorial in June, and we're invited to do that at the Supercomputing Conference, which is in Chicago in November. So we're trying to build a resilient type of pipeline there that other people might be interested in. So I'm running terribly out of time. I want to quickly tell you about what we do in this other area, which is machine learning. Remember, our problem here is to predict the long-time behavior of physical systems. Weather is a very good example because it's got turbulence in it, but we must first look at simple cases. And this is what we've been doing in that work, trying to predict and compare what the quantum device can do to enhance prediction of long-time behavior of chaotic dynamical systems. And in this case, what is actually happening that we add an additional step which we can do very effectively using a quantum device, one of the IQM ones, but it only needs 20 qubits for this problem. It's not about large qubit count, and a one-time only essential training of what's called the invariant measure, which is the sort of statistical properties of the long-time behavior of the system. They're learned by the quantum device, one time only, so we don't have to worry about the noise. And then that's used to supplement what's going on in the conventional AI. And the paper that we published on that in April, and the details here, which I'm going to gloss over but show you a pretty picture at the end, indicate that if you do this, you actually gain an advantage you can't get with a conventional machine against the best in class of the AI aficionados methods, which, if you're in the CFD area, you'll know Fourier neural operators, Markov neural operators, and a Koopman machine learning method. Those are the ones that are regarded as the best to use in weather forecasting, for instance. But we can outperform those. And so because time is short, I don't want to go into all the details here. This is a bit more of a fluid dynamics story than one that's going to be of interest to the chemist, but I think the main story is development of quantum priors is interesting because it can help, even in machine learning that I was describing for drug discovery. What we get in the picture that really conveys the business end of this is the comparison of turbulent channel flow from duct, actually, a square cross-section, of the so-called ground truth, which happens to be a single precision computation of the fluid flow at a high Reynolds number on the top row, and then comparing the quantum-informed machine learning enhancement to those three methods I mentioned earlier. You can see Koopman, FNO, and MNO. And it's the only method that maintains the structural fidelity over long times. The other ones collapse to unphysical regimes quite quickly. And you have other advantages here, which I can allude to, but are probably better discussed offline or elsewhere. If you remember, I don't really enjoy this. I have to lambast the AI community for just using so many parameters. But what's interesting when you use a quantum device is the number of parameters in the machine learning is massively reduced. And that's very helpful to the issues of explainability. Remember, we need to know what these systems are doing. And that's just, in a way, the tip of the iceberg. We have a paper that's on the archive now since then with another method that's called quantum compressed machine learning, where for a similar type of application, we've reduced the machine learned predictions of the advanced the fluid dynamics flow with a quantum algorithm which has only 8 parameters in it. And those 8 parameters represent physically meaningful things. So it's a really kind of interesting era to be in. People are getting interested in these methods for sensing and so on. So it's got a lot of promise in it. And that's just a lot of acknowledgements to all the people, or some of them and institutions or organizations who've worked with us on this. And I apologize for overrunning, but I want to thank you very much for your attention.
I think time was always, the arrow of time dictated all of us, but I'm sure with this wonderful, wonderful lecture, there should be a few questions before we go out for a cup of tea. I hope the tea is still hot. Some quick questions, yes. The method of reduction of parameters. PCA, is it PCA?
You mean in the case for the interaction potential parameters in the molecular dynamics? Yeah, so the method is non-trivial to describe. It's all in the paper, but it's like a non-linear version of principal components analysis, which is a linear method and diagonalizes a matrix. But it does a rotation to find the direction in this parameter space over which the change in uncertainty is greatest. And that's what we're looking for there. So there's a gradient descent component to it. And that's what tells you the parameters that are contributing the most greatly to the uncertainty.
I'm sorry, all the mics are in the other hall, anti-ragging campaign.
Yeah, hello, Peter. I mean, this uncertainty quantification which you talked about, is actually we have been dealing in physics for a long time, physics of complex systems, like we call it study of fluctuation properties, like whenever the fluctuations are as large as the average behavior of a physical property, then you have to study the distribution of physical properties. And not only average is not enough, you have to study the distribution of physical properties, and then you end up doing the maximum entropy modeling of the operators, or let's say random matrix modeling of the operators, and how do you calculate the eigenvalues and eigenfunctions and connect the physical properties. So what I'm thinking, I mean, like this has all this, what you have been talking about, has a big connection with this already. A lot of work has been done in physics of complex systems, these random matrix modelings and other things. So that's my comment, yeah.
And I think that's certainly true, but it's rather confined to that community, which I would say broadly is a sort of statistical physics one that understands a lot about a fluctuation phenomena and so on. But in the physics and chemistry community, looking at microscopic world where quantum or classical mechanics is being applied, it's actually shocking how absent uncertainty quantification is. So it's really astonishing that if you do electronic structure calculations as physicists or chemists, they report tables of data to umpteen decimal places on some simulation and expect us to believe that they're significant. The issue is around these questions as well. But the fluctuation phenomena part of this, I agree with, and one of the things I'm concerned about there, which is a bit digressional, is the problem of the exponents that we encounter in large language models, which have a basis, in a sense, in the analog of statistical physics as not being applied there, where we see exponents that relate to, let's say, doubling the accuracy, how much more compute you want, which scale with exponents that are less than 0.1, which means, you know, in order to double the accuracy of a given run, you're going to have to run or use computers for a vast amount more. It's a brute force approach that needs to be changed, and that's the reason why the data centers that people are using today are just out of control in the scale that they are operating at, the amount of energy and other resources they require. It's really amazing that people aren't quantifying the analysis better. Have we got another one?
I'm holding it.
My question was, how is UQ related with Monte Carlo?
Monte Carlo? Yeah, so the most familiar form of UQ is really Monte Carlo method. Monte Carlo sampling, where you just do brute force variation of the parameters and a lot of them together. And that doesn't scale very well, but it's the lowest level at which you can operate. If you want to be more sophisticated, the other methods that I mentioned, like what's called polynomial chaos, stochastic collocation, never mind this other method for large parameter sets, is designed to optimize, minimize the amount of computing you need to do to get a certain error out. Whereas Monte Carlo is literally a brute force methodology. Do you see? It's more expensive, and it's the fallback where you can't apply one of those other methods. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sorry for this single conjugate.
Yeah. So I have one question. Like regarding the uncertainty quantification. So it's already like long back. This Gaussian process regression model. It's already there, and it's not only giving the prediction, but also it is giving the uncertainty quantification. Then how like the model you are showing, like this COVID SIM, that type of model. So it's different from the the existing GPR model.
I think I'm being asked to talk a bit about Gaussian process methodologies here. So that methodology is interestingly called non-parametric, whereas parametric AI is using neural networks. And it's certainly true that in kernel-based methods you do not have a significant number of parameters, but you pay a price by making strong assumptions about the continuity of the distribution, which at the basic level is assumed to be Gaussian because it makes all the calculations much easier to do. But there now exist different kernels that represent different forms of nonlinearity. But they are usually just put in because it's your belief that that's true. Now, so you've got weaknesses there which are of a different kind. Computationally, you don't see Gaussian processes at the forefront of Nobel Prize winning or large language models, and the reason for that is if you're using really big data, those methods scale abominably because you're diagonalizing a covariance matrix on the fly. It's computationally exorbitant, so they don't usually play a role in the big games at the end.
So another one is this dimensionality reduction. So when we are doing this PCA and this thing, like so when we are doing suppose I have this very high dimension, and when I am reducing it to very low, so it is losing the information. And you have shown that even if you have this dimension greater than 100 and you are reducing it to 1, so how much like information is losing in this type of like model?
I mean, in practice, we know what the contribution from these smaller elements are in that level of uncertainty quantification, because they're related to the size of the eigenvalues that you get when you do the diagonalization of the relevant, again, kind of gradient covariance matrix. So we know what's big and what's small there. But the more interesting question to me, maybe I shouldn't be putting these words into your mouth, is if you do dimension reduction on some of these very large models, not with uncertainty quantification in mind, but the idea that I can get away with a smaller model because of the problem I mentioned earlier, that they scale shockingly badly with the size of the data set. So these big tech companies will always claim bigger is better, and it isn't, because the scalability of the transformer algorithm is terrible, and they don't care. They'll just make enormous data centers and crunch to get an improvement. It's a game of diminishing returns. But what we're trying to do is figure out if there may be the lower dimensional subsets that people have identified there contain most of the information. That's not saving us very much in the end because it's not being exploited to develop a better algorithm. But the interesting observation that I can leave you with here is one from a couple of authors, Italian authors called Colludi and Longo. They published this paper in 2017. The title of it is, I think, The Deluge of Spurious Correlations in Big Data. And they proved with some sophisticated mathematical analysis that the ratio of the true correlations, which we're interested in scientifically, to false correlations, degrades combinatorically with only one thing, and that's the size of the data set. It doesn't matter what the data is about, because even random data sets show this type of property. So what the worry is that these bigger models are just finding lots of false correlations. And maybe the sub-dimension in it is the bit that relates to the real ones. But this is an example of why we need theory inside machine learning and AI, not just saying we'll solve these problems by getting more and more data.
So you mentioned about the floating point errors. Oh, yes. So they would aggregate, and for the simulations that are really dependent on very long time results, so in those cases the errors that they would accumulate and give would actually negate the multiple trajectory data. So how does one balance the two? Gone are the days when we stopped our simulations early on. Now we go till microsecond and even further. So the errors that we are aggregating because of the floating point errors, I may end up actually getting a trajectory that was entirely unintended. How do I take care of it?
You're absolutely right. This type of problem and phenomenon is not known of typically by the MD community. But they're doing a form of nonlinear dynamics, which the nonlinear dynamicists have understood for quite a while. What's interesting about a chaotic dynamical system is it displays extreme sensitivity to the initial conditions. And so if you have a set of numbers, just suppose it's a simple case between 0 and 1, we have examples of that where we've been able to thrash this to death. You start your simulation on that interval, and the iterations go there, and it's chaotic. So it happens that we know for some of those very simple systems what the long time behavior is from a continuum analysis of the problem. It's very rare to have those closed form solutions. And then you ask, as we did, and we published a paper on this in 2019, if you put that problem, which is unbelievably trivial, onto a digital computer and you compare the results you get, there are embarrassing discrepancies. And some of the simulations go horribly wrong, produce completely the wrong invariant measure, and others look plausible. This sounds a bit like AI, but are actually wrong in the sense of differing by 15-20% from the true behavior. We don't know what's going on for real systems because we can't get closed form solutions, which incidentally is why I'm interested in analog computing, because an analog computer wouldn't have this problem. But basically, on your digital computer, you can only choose from a finite set of numbers, the floating point numbers, and which precision you're going to work on. And let's say it's single precision. The AI companies tell us we can go to half precision or quarter precision, but suppose it's the single precision. Are you aware there are only 4 billion numbers available? So by the way, what does that mean for a large language model that has trillions of parameters? I can't do this calculation in FP32. I'd have to do a 64-bit one. But just stick with me with those 4 billion parameters. We've done that calculation numerically because you can do it and store all the numbers in the memory of the machine. What you find is, over time with a simple system, that all those, they're rational numbers and a subset of the rational numbers, they all end up on periodic orbits. They're unstable periodic orbits, which mean, in the language of measure theory, they have virtually zero probability, because what you're missing are the irrational numbers, which have endless recurring information in them. But it's that you have to keep going if the trajectory is not going to end up on an unstable periodic orbit. So you're doomed to get a wrong answer, and some of the things you were saying are correct. The floating point round-off will make lots of these initial states, which are different and meant to be diverging, actually converge. And lots of problems there, which we understand for the particular system we're talking about there. How you extend that to much bigger problems is really challenging. The community who does dynamical systems usually looks at very simple problems. So there are open issues there, yes.
So do you take care of this issue in your impeccable recipe?
No, we don't do that. But actually, that's, as I said at the beginning, that's an issue of verification for the model. When you start using discrete numbers to represent a continuous system, how is that? Can you verify that it's going to give you the same results? And I've just told you in a very simple case, the answer is no. So we need to get control over that. But there are some ways of trying to deal with it that involve techniques that are called stochastic rounding. So you just add a statistical noise to prevent the trajectory actually going on to the unstable periodic orbits, and that's supposed to help get us out of that. We know that it does sometimes work and it doesn't on other times. But we're also trying to solve these problems quickly and with less energy. And you start running random seeds all the time, you're actually making the calculation energetically substantially more expensive. And I know from these cases that an FP64 calculation is the same price as doing FP32 with stochastic rounding. Do you see? So there are all these sort of trade-offs there.
Although we have talked about molecular dynamics, I did not see any dynamics in the output that you have been talking about. For example, in the case of the ligand problem, say K on or K off, these are the experimental quantities that we usually come across. So within the pipeline that you are talking about, is there any way of incorporating these rate constants?
You have to understand things slowly and surely, and equilibrium is the best place to start. So I would like to think we sort of nailed where that problem has been. Now you're talking about the non-equilibrium processes, and I totally agree. We have one project on the go which is trying to address things like that, the off rate for a particular peptide epitope binding to an MHC protein in immunology. We know experimentally depends strongly on the off rate there. So to try and calculate that, we have to do different things, non-equilibrium molecular dynamics, and in our case, we're using Markov state models to get access to that. And those are computationally overwhelming compared with the equilibrium case, but they are tractable on very large supercomputers. So we have a project going on at the moment which is addressing that case, and it is very important, but I can't tell you any more with authority about it.
So when you are saying about QMMM type of calculation using quantum computer, so there is the electronic embedding scheme in QMMM. So that incorporates the polarization effect of the MM region itself in the Hamiltonian of the QM region. So with that, when you build your quantum circuit, there will be enormous number of parameters. How good those parameters converge to the true energy? Because I think that it will be also cost, because your optimizer is a classical optimizer, right? After you are getting those parameters. So now there are plenty of parameters because it is taking the polarization effects inside the Hamiltonian. So
doing this, the short answer is one uses specific QMM methodology. The thing that's different when we talk about the quantum computing is how you deal with the wave function part of this problem. And that wave function I discussed earlier, you can choose methods to do it. And we use this QSCI methodology, but it's based on embedding of that part of the problem in the DFT component. And the embedding problem, no one's done that as far as I'm aware properly in a quantum context before. There is a shifting of the sands while these computations are going on, and you're tracking all of that to look at the reaction coordinate. And at the moment, this is done essentially like a Born-Oppenheimer type approach where we freeze the thing. It's not dynamical. But there are parameters, quite a lot of them, as you say, that are being used. And at the moment, they're used because that we have some intuition. We do that kind of calculation already. But I did say at the beginning here that there is scope for using uncertainty quantification in the way I was describing earlier on those types of calculations. But for most people at the moment, it's just wrestling with or getting access to the resources to start building the models. When you have a pipeline, like I've said we've now developed, and we've got 2 or 3 people who want to use it, this is going to start to become important. But I can't say more than that now.
Sir, so you talked about that autoproteolysis. event. So till now we are making molecules and modifying them according to the protein environment. So does this means that we will find a more way to modify the protein instead of the molecule and make all the, like whatever the database the molecule has, drug molecules has, we will instead of modifying molecules, we will modify the proteins and make them fit into that model so that we can get more heat molecules.
So obviously if you can handle larger systems, that's what one is aiming for with this technology, and you can allow the quantum mechanics to do the talking rather than having parameterized with classical force fields, then all sorts of things become possible. And again, it's sort of intoxicating if you don't understand the limitations we're operating with at the moment, that I could then just walk in and do things like that. But for example, covalently bound inhibitors, this is quite a big new area, is one where bonds are being made. And yes, I think quantum computing could help with this. But these tend to start becoming bigger problems in the sense of what matters to determine what you can fit on the machine is this number of electrons and orbitals that are in play. And we're still severely limited versus what we would like to do. And I just want to mention, if you've seen the hype for quantum computing, there's a cofactor in nitrogen fixation called FOMOCO that's been claimed for a long time as the target which would distinguish quantum computing methods from classical. But in January this year, a guy called Garnet Chan at Caltech produced a paper which is using classical methods that gets good energy estimates for the FOMOCO molecule. And the quantum computing is nowhere there yet. That's a really highly delocalized system. So there's very strong correlation across the whole structure. So we have to be kind of realistic about what we're able to do in the short term.
So when we are dealing with algorithm SQD, their subspace diagonalization is still challenging in the post-processing process. So what is scenario here? Because there, whenever we go for higher accuracy, our dimension increase. So there, the subspace diagonalization again a challenge. So how that things are happening in this algorithm QSCI?
What's your question? What is the question?
The question is, when we are doing the SQD during the post-processing, we have to diagonalize by projecting on the subspace. So when we go for higher accuracy, we need to diagonalize a higher order matrix. So what is scenario here in this algorithm QSCI?
Well, in the end, of course, we want scalable methods that can be used with better machines and fault-tolerant ones in the future, where we can do bigger parts of the calculation on the quantum device. The scary thing of what I was saying earlier is, even with these NIST devices, a sampling like this ends up giving us some pretty big problem to diagonalize. I mentioned billion by billion matrices. And that's just saying, you're transferring out of the natural habitat of the wave function onto a classical machine because there's too much noise getting in the way. We would love to eradicate that noise, and fault-tolerant computing holds out a hope for that. If you're IBM, you're claiming by 2029, perhaps we'll have it. But they make many announcements that don't come true. And, the DARPA in the Department of Defense, whatever it is in the US, has a project to track the performance of these different devices to figure out which of them are the best bet to go to the fault-tolerant era. But there's one other problem with the quantum devices which is still with us, and I've seen no one attempt to properly solve it, and that's the appallingly short, what you could call coherence time, in which you can do the calculations, which is typically maybe, if you're lucky, milliseconds. With some technologies it might be longer, but it's still like seconds or something. Now that's ridiculous compared with a conventional stable supercomputer like Frontier. Potentially I can run calculations on that for weeks. And it's not going to collapse in that fashion. So my parting shot on that, by the way, is I don't think we understand wave function collapse. After all, we clearly don't, because there are so many people offering interpretations of it that aren't consistent, and they're subjective. They vary according to who says it. So we don't actually understand all the processes that are going on quantum mechanically to ensure these machines will be stable. So there's a place for some pretty fundamental thinking there, in my humble opinion.
So I think for the sake of the arrow of time, as the sun has set, and Professor Coveney had a very long day in the last 48 hours, meetings after meetings, interactions. I think we had a very responsible and a very responsive audience. There was one point of time, all the dogs were in the kennel, and the Hamiltonian operator was running full scale. So this was fantastic. I think we close this, but we open up a new chapter of interactions with Professor Coveney and his team in London and in different countries. And we have a lot of plans which will be revealed to you as our director, Professor Chakraborty, has promised, and all the other deans like Professor Dasgupta here and others, they have responded very well. So I think what mattered today in this gathering is the presence of youngsters, the students. And at one point of time, it was very encouraging. I think the eye contacts, the heads nodding, and the response to the stimulus were excellent. Thank you so much. Let's give a final applause, which is not enough for a person of his stature and experience, but he came down to our level, and I'm mixing with him last 48 hours, another 48 hours to go, and then we go to Kolkata, where he's delivering a talk at the Research Park as a part of the Platinum Jubilee celebrations with another speaker. Thank you. Thank you so much.